It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's November 29th, 1976, and this is Dialogue Conspiracy number 245. The bulk of the program, most of the time, I'm going to be speaking about the new congressional investigation that's into its second week on the John Kennedy assassination and the Martin Luther King assassination, and the new memos and wiretap conversation of Lee Harvey Oswald that the CIA have now said they have had since 1963. But I do want to talk for just a few minutes on several subjects that are pertinent before we get into that. One is Gary Mark Gilmore. I haven't said anything about him in the last 2 weeks on Dialogue Conspiracy. That's the young gentleman, he's not so young, he's almost 36, who asked to die before a firing squad in Salt Lake City, Utah. And the decision of whether or not he will get the chance to be killed by the firing squad will be made tomorrow. The court, the three people on the Board of Pardons are meeting tomorrow morning. And I received a telephone call from London, England this morning. A gentleman very much concerned about this matter who was flying from London, England to Salt Lake City to halt the execution of Gary Mark Gilmore. And this gentleman has done extensive research. He works with Philip Agee, the gentleman who's now almost going to be deported from England, who wrote Inside the Company. And this person called me because he wanted to know what I could do to help stop the firing squad killing of Gary Gilmore. And I didn't go into it last week. I went extensively into mind control, electrode implants, and government use of acid, at least $26 million for just a few projects that were done up through 1974. But the importance of spending so much time on that one project was to give an idea of the extensive coverage of the use of mind control by Army intelligence and the CIA, and covered up by the Justice Department in our prison systems. And the important thing about Gary Gilmore is that I sincerely believe, as do hundreds of people around the country and across the seas and overseas, that he is the victim of programming, either hypnosis or electrode implants. And there's been so much coverage of this story of his taking pills and almost dying from that, the suicidal tendency. But the important thing is the profile of Gary Gilmore and what would happen if he's allowed to have the firing squad execution and set this precedent in the United States, when we're always trying to reduce the possibility of police states and military dictatorships. His asking for this death penalty is a very macho thing. Give me 6 bottles of Coors and let me die a man. Why so many people, and particularly so many black people on death row across the country, would be dying by the reversal of the death penalty decision. And he sets the example. I'm a man. I want to die. I did wrong. And he gives this heroic speech. But the question is he doing it out of his own free will and accord? The problem with this case of Gary Mark Gilmore is that he was taken to, he lived in Utah, but he was taken to a prison in Oregon, and he stayed at Oregon State Prison for a while, where he developed a reputation for being a chronic troublemaker, and he built a profile identical to the central figure in Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest. It was recently made into a film of the Oregon institutions. And they took him for the prison for whatever he was in for, and he actually had been a model citizen and a fairly good person. He was first put into a reform school at the age 14 because he broke a window in a school. And his father paid for the window, but they put him a year and a half in a reform school anyway, and that began a long series of confinements for a person with an IQ of 130, who's very bright, a very good artist, a poet, draws quite well, and he was taken from one institution to another. But when he got to Oregon State Prison, they put him into the mental hospital in Oregon, where they said he was trouble, and there's no definition yet of what exactly was the trouble. It could have been like One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest, where he didn't want television taken away or some other thing. But he was put into what was described in the New York Times as, in quotes, a special treatment center and confined to the psychiatric section where they began extensive shock treatments on him. And he complained about these. He said that he had been strapped down in his bed for 2 weeks and was given extensive shock treatments. And he told this to his uncle, and it will come out later after he's dead in the book, that he complained about this, and he said he never wanted to go into prison again. So after he was released, he became a model parolee, and he was quiet, and he was drawing, and he had a job for $3.50 an hour. And he did oil painting and charcoal drawings that he had started when he was in prison. Then he met a woman, the New York Times, November 9th, 1976, described, who was about 20 years old, who drank and smoked with him, and he moved from his uncle's place, and he was just with her several days when he checked into a motel next door to where he was living, next door to his uncle. And he walked up to the manager and shot him twice in the head. And he was accused of killing one other person. But there's a quotation in this New York Times article that's more important than the miles of newspaper coverage I've had in the last 3 weeks. He said, I felt there's no way that what happened could have been avoided. There was no other chance or choice for Mr. Bushnell, the man he killed. It was something that could not be stopped. And it goes on to say that Gary Gilmore told his lawyers about his disappointment when the court-appointed psychiatrist would not support his contention that he had no control over his actions. He said his only memory of the crime was confused, distorted pictures, something like watching someone else pull a trigger, looking at the scene through a wall of water. And it sounded like he was in deep hypnosis and either had injections similar to Candy Jones, the woman that used to work for the CIA that I've mentioned on Dialogue Conspiracy before, or he's hypnotically or surgically controlled. And so I called Judge Latimer, who's one of 3 people. He's the chairman of the Board of Pardons, and gave the information that in California we had a series of violences like Herbert Mullen, who went to Hawaii in the company of a woman, came home, went to a priest, and said, I was told to kill him. He heard voices telling him to kill this priest. Or Lawrence Kwong, a person from California who was taken in the company of a woman to Hawaii and returned, and then he went to a private investigator about 30 times and said that he was hearing sounds, that he was kept being told to go to KGO radio station, and the detective didn't know what happened or didn't take him seriously, and he was staying at a mental hospital in San Francisco at the time, that he had a gun there and had been escorted to Hawaii and home. And he walked up to radio station KGO and he killed Mr. Ben Munson in the station and then killed himself. I think it's interesting that the woman that was with Gilmore after he left his uncle's, where he was doing really well, who was with him and is now tried to commit suicide, or at least they said she did, is now in a mental hospital. She isn't taken to an ordinary hospital like other people who are suicidal. They get over it and put out at large where she can visit him now that she's recovered. She is in a mental hospital and evidently can't even talk to him on the telephone. So I suggested to the chairman of Board of Pardons, this is Mr. Judge Latimer's secretary in the office, that they investigate this particular woman, Nicole, that he was with, where she came from, where she worked, was she in mental hospitals earlier, and subpoena the records from the Oregon hospital, who treated him, and then examine him physically, because they've already suggested that he signed papers that his body be given to medical research, so that if there were any electrode implants and anyone knew it, they could immediately take part of the head and throw it away. The little electrode actually is so tiny you could hardly see it. I don't even know if it's visible to the eye. It's inserted in the back of the head under the skin. So it's a question of whether it would even be visible. But I believe that there's a very political reason for wanting him to request the firing squad. It's a very good visual thing. There's already a $500,000 fortune in this, possible movie, book rights, lawyers' fees. It's become an industry, and it's become industry in a state like Salt Lake City, which is so much part of the Howard Hughes CIA intelligence community. So many people involved in that state have been part of secret operations and manipulations that I've studied for such a long time, that I'm very suspicious of the whole thing and his anxiety to die. I also want to keep you up next week, up to date on the Howard Hughes case. There's a gentleman in Texas who has a newsletter. It's $200 a month on the Howard Hughes cases in Houston, Texas, and in Los Angeles and Las Vegas, Nevada. And those of you that listen to Dialogue Conspiracy know the article that I wrote in Playgirl several years ago, December 74, that Howard Hughes was buried in 1971. So, of course, I'm interested in this case, and I follow everything that I can on it to see how much and how clear my evidence is on the case. There was an article today in the Las Vegas Sun that Melvin Dummar, who would receive $120 million from the Howard Hughes will, is going to be grilled extensively on when he claims he saw Howard Hughes in the desert. And they're taking handwriting samples of Dummar to see if there's any chance that the will was a forgery. They haven't gone on to say he could have done it, but they want to take handwriting samples, and they've asked extensive documentation on the length of the paper or the ink, how old it is. There's various lawyers that are questioning this will, that they don't believe it was an accurate will at all, and it seems that Melvin Dummar is going to be grilled extensively on this. The attorney, in this case, Mr. Roden, who's representing Harold Roden, is one of the executors of the Howard Hughes estate, said that we're trying to get information and the SUMA people won't give it to us. This is a quotation from today's paper. He said the SUMA officials have dodged subpoenas, and one even went to hide in a tool shed until the process server went away. This attorney said that he can't take depositions from Howard Hughes physicians, he can't reach any personal aides, and he can't locate them. Nobody knows where they are when you call them, and they never call back, and they don't say when they're coming back. Judge Hayes in Nevada said that if this is getting too serious, they should inform him, and he would try to find the aides. Ever since Howard Hughes died, the aides and the physicians are not available. They're in hiding, and I believe they have a lot to hide. Mr. Roden, an attorney for some of the members of the Hughes family, have asked for chemical tests to determine the age of the will, and they also want fingerprints on this will to see whose fingerprints are on it. But they're afraid that if they do that, the document will be injured or destroyed. So it's behind plastic, handled with tweezers, and 15 handwriting experts have been called in. And in the meanwhile, there's been a request before the judge that they don't call it the Mormon will anymore. It's a nickname because it was found at the office of the president of the Mormon Church the same day that John Connolly was there, 2 days after John Connolly left the office. So the attorney, James Dilworth, who's trying to prove the will is a fraud, asked that the name be changed from the Mormon will to give it a name, just call it the document, to refer to the purported will and not the Mormon will, because he claims that it gives it a certain dignity. I happen to see it other way around. I think it's funny to call it the Mormon will if it's planted and if it's fake, and if the Mormon Church was to receive millions and millions of dollars and it's found on the desk there. I think the title Mormon will is really funny if it's a forgery, that they be the recipient of the money and also it be located right on their desk. I think it's an appropriate name, but the lawyers have asked it be called a purported will, and that's what it's going to be called. But I do have this first newsletter that's come out, and I will keep you up on that subject. There also was another article in the paper over the holidays that I didn't get a chance to go into detail. I don't want to do it this program, but I will do it also next week, I hope. But if you read any articles on this new ship, there's a ship that was sunk in 1945 outside of Hong Kong, a Japanese ship, and there's a reported $5 billion in diamonds and jewels and art objects. And I talked several weeks ago about a new book that's out called The File on the Tsar with Lydia Blades. We did a show on that. And I mentioned the book by John Toland, Adolf Hitler. And I think that one of the clues of the 20th century, one of the biggest mysteries or combines, is going to be this ship that could be the jewels that were taken from Manchuria, that belonged to the Tsar's family, that were taken out of Russia to Manchuria, that were on this ship. And I also think that that's the original reason the Glomar Explorer was built, to bring up the $5 billion jewels that belonged to the Tsar of Russia and the Tsarina. I heard Ronald Reagan on a radio show this week asking for the Glomar Explorer to be put into operation. And today's news had a story that the CIA lied about the Glomar not being successful. That was really successful. And the original reason for building the Glomar Explorer allegedly had nothing to do with the Russian ship, but to get jewels and minerals off the bottom of the ocean. So next week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I will be talking about this sunken ship. But if you've seen any articles, in the meantime, save them, because this is one of the biggest stories to come out of, say, World War I and II, and I believe that many of the pieces fit together very carefully here. So we'll talk about that, but I didn't want to give it too much time today. I did want to talk about the Congressional Committee that's meeting because I've ignored them for a few weeks. But the emphasis on dialogue conspiracy for the weeks or years to come probably is going to go into the subjects and the new books out, such as The File on the Tsar, this new book by Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold, the book by John Toland called Adolf Hitler, and there's one by Anthony Scaduto on the lonesome death of Bruno Hauptmann. He was charged with the Lindbergh killing, and Mr. Scaduto, who's a good researcher, says that Hauptmann didn't kill the Lindbergh child. Incidentally, the son of Charles Lindbergh is one of the two men that are being instrumental in this barge out at this time. Their names are involved in this one, an astronaut from NASA and the son of Charles Lindbergh. The assassination of John Kennedy that I researched for so many years, and we're starting our 14th year now, is only one small act I certainly learned in the long series of conspiracies. It's the one that interests me the most. It's the one I've done the most research on. But it was the one that clued me to all these other subjects, such as mind control or electrode implants or the killing of the Tsar, or the alleged killing, if they actually were alive, or the programming of Hitler. All of my curiosity into these conspiracies began at the time that John Kennedy was killed. And the killing of Kennedy led me to friends of Lee Harvey Oswald, who were Nazis from World War II that were living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and to various space engineers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and that were related to NASA. And I began to study so many conspiracies, and the two common denominators, the three common denominators that go back, say, from the time that the communists took control in Russia and it became the Soviet Union. One common denominator is oil, the search for oil, the use of Howard Hughes as a CIA front, and he owned this exclusive drill for oil bits. The use of Allen Dulles representing the Rockefellers, the oil people, the CIA front, doing work for the oil, the Rockefellers, the Exxon, Standard Oil people, and then the combine of the oil people in Texas. And the combination of the oil people is a very strong ingredient. And mind control, the use of mind control, say, from Richard Nixon, Adolf Hitler, or Rasputin with his expertise at hypnosis, and then Adolf Hitler in the Munich beer gardens. Lydia Blades, who was on the show with me a few weeks ago talking about the Tsar and the Tsar family, told me about a book she has describing Adolf Hitler in the Munich beer gardens. It's a book on conspiracies. It was published in 1946, and we'll be doing some more shows on that. And it tells about the rise of Hitler and the use of Hitler as a front, and he was approached at the Munich beer gardens, and his interest was in the oil. A lot of the oil people were behind, and the ammunitions people, of course, behind Adolf Hitler. And one of them was Herbert Hoover, who was an oil speculator from until 1914, when the Tsar was thrown out. Herbert Hoover allegedly, according to this book, was interested in the oil fields in Russia, 7 oil fields, and invested almost $1 billion in these oil fields, and the oil was confiscated, of course, when the communists came in. So you could see that a president of the United States, such as Herbert Hoover, who loses his money to the Russians that took over the oil fields, would hardly be objective in an era, say, in the 30s of the Cold War, when at the time that the armament people were building up Adolf Hitler in Germany and Nazi Germany and rearming Germany against the Versailles Treaty. And the Cold War at home was beginning, the nursing ground to come down in Alger Hiss, and later the Rosenbergs. You could see that a man like Herbert Hoover, who had an investment in Russia and lost up to maybe $1 billion in oil deposits or investments, speculation, and so forth, would make a very good president of the United States, and how much he would allow us secretly to rearm Germany and be sympathetic to the Axis, and also then to Franco, who was coming into power in Spain. The Hoover Library at Stanford is a nesting ground of white Russian exiles. It's a place that Solzhenitsyn comes visit. Stanford research is very much a part of California mind control and brain experimentation, electrode implants that are taking place all over the United States. But you have a storehouse of literature on the white Russians, the Russian community, at Stanford Library, the Hoover Library. And Herbert Hoover, it seems now, also had a vested interest in what was going on in the Soviet, before it was the Soviet Union. So that your domestic Cold War strategies, your manipulations, are motivated from sometimes the dollar as much as from any other patriotic reason. And Lee Harvey Oswald had friends in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, oil geologists. They all worked for the oil company. George DeMoranville, they were either in ammunitions or the oil industry, guarding the oil industry down there. Many, many people that he knew and Marina Oswald knew. The common denominator of these conspiracies, as I say, is oil and mind control, the use of mind control, behavior modification to alter your patsies and to continue a Cold War strategy. It's terribly important. One of the things that I'm worrying about in the new Congress that will be reconvening in January, and the committee that's working now, is they're leaving out the link of Nazis and oil people, and the importance of the Nazis that worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that also worked in Nazi Germany. And I had several hundred letters made up that I'm mailing out to various people that I know in the media and also congressional people, and I stated certain things in there that are important, and I want to share them with you. And I've had them on the radio program before in a different form, but this is what I put: a letter titled World Nazis, Walter Dornberger, Michael Payne, Lee Harvey Oswald, General Reinhard Gehlen, Alan Dulles, and Clay Shaw. What I said was that Sheriff Roger Craig testified before the Warren Commission in Volume 6, page 270, that Lee Harvey Oswald admitted getting into Mrs. Ruth Payne's white station wagon 15 minutes after John Kennedy was shot. He ran down the grass into the car at the sound of a honk. And the mention of Payne bothered Oswald that afternoon in the police department because, according to the testimony of Sheriff Craig, everybody would know who I am now. That's what Lee Harvey Oswald said. And the question is, who is Lee Harvey Oswald? What is he doing at the home of Michael Payne, a third-generation Harvard scientist who was taking care of Marina from April 63 when Oswald went to New Orleans, and then she took her down there and picked her up while he was in Mexico, and Michael Payne worked at Bell Aircraft, where Walter Dornberger, head of Bell Aircraft, worked. And he was a Nazi war criminal. Instead of being hung, he was sent to Texas. And Werner von Braun of NASA, Dornberger's partner at the rocket factory, used slave labor there. They worked with the General Hans Kammler, his name is Kammler, designer of Auschwitz and concentration camps. The Lee Harvey Oswald that the new House committee is investigating, who talked on the telephone to the embassy, the Russian embassy, and tell them he would exchange information with them in exchange for money to go to the Soviet Union, is an altogether different Lee Harvey Oswald than the original Warren report started with. Now, one of the things that bothers me about the committee in Washington, D.C. that I've talked about is that they should have had past investigators in there right from the very beginning to clarify the role of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico and in the Soviet Union, because as these memos come in, they take them seriously, and some of them could be forged or planted, and they have no way of knowing, if they haven't gone through the 26 volumes, how much of this believe and how much is not believable. And the result of not having the researchers there to advise them and not being allowed to get to them, if you write or telephone, is that it's going to affect the results of this inquiry. Each of us should be allowed time to summarize our conclusions before that committee and present a bibliography so that they know what questions to ask. And my worst fears of stories being planted or altered or changed is coming through. And a few weeks ago I read on KLRB my opinion of how dangerous it would be to proceed without seeing the various researchers. And of course this is happening. The very first week that they met, they had a memo that Oswald reportedly had told the persons in the Cuban agency before the assassination that he was going to kill John Kennedy. Well, that occupied the first week before the holidays of the new committee. Did Lee Harvey Oswald tell people in advance that he was going to kill John Kennedy? And if he did, why didn't they do anything about it? Well, this kind of memo has to be planted. There's no basis of that. It defies logic, and the memo could never exist for many, many reasons. For one, if the Cubans didn't want to be blamed for the killing of John Kennedy, if a man walks in and says, I'm going to kill John Kennedy, and tells the Cuban agency, and they don't warn the American officials, the FBI or Secret Service, they would be partly responsible for his death. And if they didn't plan his death, why in the world wouldn't they warn people? So I don't believe that he told them at all, because I think they would have told the Secret Service, the FBI. The second point is that Oswald went to the Cuban agency and asked for a visa into Cuba, and they wouldn't allow him into Cuba. They didn't trust him, and they rejected him all along. So how could Lee Harvey Oswald be planning to kill John Kennedy with the assistance and knowledge of Castro, and Castro wouldn't have anything to do with Lee Harvey Oswald? If Fidel Castro rejected Oswald, why would he then be using him to kill John Kennedy? And how many killers go around leaving messages, I'm going to kill the president in a month, and they're not picked up? Now, the CIA has a picture in the Warren Commission volumes, and it came out last year. There was a lot of publicity of a man using the name Lee Harvey Oswald, a heavy-set man who was at the Cuban embassy with thin hair. His hair was thinning, and he's 34 years old and fat. Oswald was younger and thinner. And Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, identified this picture as Oswald. So maybe it was this same Oswald who was on the telephone saying, calling the Cuban embassy and saying, I'm going to give you information if you pay my way to Russia. How could you identify this voice at that time? They only typed up the transcript. They don't have the tape recordings of Lee Harvey Oswald's voice. So if a man goes to the rifle range and says, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, and Oswald was in Mexico at the time, or if he goes to a car agency and says, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, and Oswald is not even in Dallas that day, he's in Irving, Texas, and hadn't left the house. Or if a man goes to a gun shop and says, put a scope on this gun, I'm Oswald, and if Oswald's gun already had a scope on it, if he even had a gun, which I don't believe he did, if somebody was using the name of Oswald, why couldn't they just go down to the Cuban embassy or go down to Mexico City and telephone the Russian embassy, which is wiretapped and later be used if people begin to investigate the assassination, they can produce these documents? Why didn't they just, why couldn't a person saying, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, and if you give me money to go to Russia, I will give you information that's valuable to you? If somebody uses his name 10 or 12 times, there's no reason to believe they couldn't have been on the telephone. So we have no way of knowing that what was typed up or transcribed was Lee Harvey Oswald at all. It's unlikely that anybody who really intended to kill the President of the United States would go around in advance telling the Cuban embassy they were going to do it. That's highly unlikely. And afterwards, Lee Harvey Oswald said, I didn't kill anybody. He wasn't proud of it, and he said he didn't do it, that he was innocent, and he wanted a lawyer. So there's quite a contradiction there of killing somebody and being blamed as a patsy and being terrified and walking around and telling everybody, oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to bump off the president. It doesn't make sense. Now, as far as that memo goes that the committee has in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover was supposed to have hid this memo since 1964, and the Warren Commission didn't know about it, and neither did anybody investigating the assassination. Now, that's totally out of context with J. Edgar Hoover. He worked with the anti-Castro Cubans. His friends were at the racetrack. His only interest in life outside the FBI was the racetrack. He met with people like Mr. Murchison, the oilman who had the Del Mar racetrack in California. He would stay as their guest. He knew the mafia people in Lansky and organized crime figures. He was familiar with them. He used them in the FBI. And it's very unlikely that he would be protecting their chance to get back to Cuba, because Havana was the center of the drug market and prostitution and organized crime, the gaming tables and the money, the roulette wheels and so forth. So when the Bay of Pigs operation took place and the criminal element was not able to return to Cuba, John Kennedy withdrew. It seems that they would use every opportunity, J. Edgar Hoover and his anti-Castro Cuban cronies, to say, oh, see, what a mistake Kennedy made here. Oswald worked with Castro, and we've protected him. I don't believe for a minute that J. Edgar Hoover kept a memo in his desk since 1964 that Lee Harvey Oswald said in advance he was going to kill John Kennedy. He would have pulled that out so fast, because the Warren Commission, according to the minutes of the meetings and the way they interrogated the witnesses, were bleeding for a communist story. They even sent a man, Isaac Don Levine, who worked with Whittaker Chambers and assisted Richard Nixon all of his life. They sent him down to Texas to talk with Marina Oswald to bleed a Russian story out of her, to bleed a communist story out of her. That's in the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings. that Isaac Don Levine went down there to bleed a more communist story. So they looked for every chance they could get, and every witness that testified against Lee Harvey Oswald would simply say that they saw a coffee book on the table of Das Kapital or 2 books. Those books never showed up after he was dead, but to hear it, 30 or 40 people paraded through his home where he put on the table his story about communism and his love for Marxism. And he did it to people who were chief of security at Convair and oil engineers and people that worked for the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency and Mobil Oil and Saucony Oil. All these people, Michael Payne with top security clearances, all these witnesses were supposed to look at Oswald's book on Marxism, which is also unlikely. Now, I've mentioned many times that E. Howard Hunt, the master forger of the DM cables, could, I'm not saying he did it, but he could have other people like him or not him, if not himself, who are forging documents so that as the committee keeps going in Washington, they'll just keep producing forged documents. I talked about that when the committee first got formed, when Mr. Sprague was appointed as the lawyer, and my worst fears are coming true. And so if I repeat it on Dialogue Conspiracy, it's so that you can see how all of a sudden, like a rabbit pulled out of a hat, each week we can have a new surprise memo. The new congressional committee is starting with their weakest point, and that is the weakest point is looking for a communist conspiracy in the killing of John Kennedy. So the first week they had Lee Harvey Oswald telling somebody in the Cuban embassy that he's going to kill John Kennedy. And then the second week after the holidays get going, Thanksgiving, the second week, the congressional committee is provided with a scoop by the Washington Post, none other than the great Washington Post that gave us Woodward and Bernstein, and they gave us Watergate without Howard Hughes and Bibi Rebozo or Rosemary Wood, or the real money funding behind Richard Nixon and the whole Cold War, or the same reporters that gave us the story of Watergate without mentioning the murder of J. Edgar Hoover or the Wallace shooting or the killing of Mary Jo Kopechne. It's the Washington Post, again, a story by Ronald Kiesler. This is the article this week that in late September of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico, and that he telephoned the Soviet embassy and said, let's make a deal in exchange for unspecified information. He wanted a free trip to Europe. Now, when you speak of Lee Harvey Oswald, in addition to the possibility that another person was saying it, there also has to be clarified which Oswald we're talking about, because there were 4 Oswalds. There were 2 very clear-cut Lee Harvey Oswalds, one using his name all over the place, as I mentioned before, and the one that was studying Russian in the Marines, the one that was at the bases, the U-2 bases in Japan and the Philippines, the one that learned the electronic and radar, the same one that learned the Russian language and did bring that Russian woman home to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now that Oswald, if it wasn't somebody impersonating his voice, it could possibly have been that he wanted to exchange unspecified information for a free trip, and it could have been for CIA information, because not only when you talk about Oswald do you talk about 2 different Oswalds or 3 or 4, but you also have to say that the Russians in the embassy, whether they're in the Soviet Union or a Russian in the embassy in the United States or a Russian in the embassy in the Mexico City office, has a 50-50 chance, if not an 80-20, of being a member of the Central Intelligence Agency. The KGB and the CIA are so close to one that it's hard to define it, because when World War II was over, Reinhard Gehlen's agents were behind the Iron Curtain. He was chief of intelligence for Adolf Hitler, Eastern Division, and he received his $200 million minimum from the CIA, so that the people that Lee Harvey Oswald could be speaking to, if it was him on the telephone saying, give me the money to go back to Russia and I'll exchange information, could have been the Oswald that was working for the CIA, who was giving information. And this is an important point as you read the newspapers about the Kennedy assassination. This Oswald could have been giving information about the Kennedy assassination that was going to take place, or give it to them afterwards, after he was flown out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. This Lee Harvey Oswald could have been working with the CIA when he told the Russian embassy that he would exchange information for a trip back to Russia. The American State Department paid his way home, and they're not going to write a check for him to go back, but they could do it through an agent of Gehlen stationed in Mexico City. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald went to the passport office in New Orleans in June 1963 and asked for a passport to go to the Soviet Union, and within 24 hours he got it. But he also asked for separate passports because he intended to separate from Marina Oswald very shortly, and he also would need money. He had no known job, and I'm sure the money would come to him to go back to the Soviet Union from the CIA, just like the money came to him to come home from the Soviet Union from the government when he asked to come home. 2 weeks after the assassination of John Kennedy, Marina Oswald received a letter telling her, allegedly from Lee Harvey Oswald, allegedly written in April, telling her to get rid of his clothing and to save only the important papers, that there were legal documents and important papers he would need. This is in volume 16 of the Warren Commission hearings, a photograph of that letter, and he also, that's the famous letter where he says he distrusts the notorious FBI and that Agent Hosty, James Hosty from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, was offering Marina a citizenship and protection. Now, why would he be telling the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., that the FBI was working with Marina Oswald and taking care of her needs in the future, which would be 2 weeks from that date? November the 9th, he wrote the letter. November the 22nd was John Kennedy's assassination. Oswald was not only in touch with the Russian embassy in Mexico City, but he was in touch with the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., and I have every reason to believe that these are Galen's men and that he had confidence. He's writing to them. The letter's reproduced. He has confidence to tell them that the FBI is taking care of Marina. And certainly that Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. would be very suspicious of this or wonder what that was about, or why would he even be writing to them unless he trusted them. If he were really a Russian spy, he wouldn't be leaving clues all over, like, I'm working with Castro, I want to kill Kennedy, and I'll make deals with you. I don't think that espionage works that way. I don't think you talk on telephones. You meet in out-of-way places or pay phones in strange places, and you don't disclose on the telephone where it's tape recorded at every embassy what you're going to do. Spies don't work that way, and Lee Harvey Oswald certainly was sophisticated enough. He had top security clearance and knowledge of all the radar in the Pacific area and had radio training, electronic training. He was trained in Russian language and microdotting. And it's a little ridiculous to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald sits on a telephone in Mexico City and says, pay my way back to Russia and I'll give you information. Oswald could only make a deal like that and believe that the tape-recorded conversation wouldn't be revealed if the person at the other end was working with the CIA, and that he had knowledge that they were CIA and that the CIA money would go to Mexico City and would look like the Russian embassy. His request for this free trip to Russia was allegedly intercepted and recorded by the CIA at the time. This is what the Washington Post says. And they go on to say this week that the CIA didn't turn this over to the FBI. Now, a conversation of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City in September 1963, he's down there, and then he's going to go back to a home of Michael Payne. His wife stays, who's his security clearance, Bell Aircraft, third-generation nuclear physicist, designer of Bell Aircraft helicopters. They're staying at that home. Lee Harvey Oswald is going to make this deal, and the CIA is going to pick up information. They're an information-gathering agency in September 1963, and we're supposed to believe that somehow they just didn't tell the FBI about a Lee Harvey Oswald who returned back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That was September. And November, the President of the United States is going to come there. Now, there's only one reason why they didn't have to tell the FBI, and I believe through my 13 years of research and many documents and cross-filing of information and minutes of the Warren Commission with each other, that Oswald all along worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He worked for them and Navy intelligence in the Marines and in New Orleans, in the Soviet Union, and in Mexico, which was their terrain. Then, when he returned in June 1962 to the Dallas-Fort Worth area from the Soviet Union with Marina, he worked for the FBI in the Fort Worth, Dallas, and New Orleans area. And the reason that the CIA didn't have to turn over any conversation about how Oswald would get back to the Soviet Union is simply because the FBI, on a need-to-know basis, had their own contacts through James Hosty in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Lee and Marina Oswald. In October 1963, a month before John Kennedy was killed, the CIA allegedly told the FBI that Oswald had made contact with the Russians. Well, they may have told the FBI, but it's perfectly obvious that the FBI and the Secret Service would not move on it because I believe they were part of the Kennedy assassination. The Washington Post story says the CIA gave the Warren Commission a transcript of their taped conversation of Lee Harvey Oswald calling from Mexico City to the Russian embassy in Mexico City, but for unexplained reasons, they failed to include in the transcript Oswald's offer of information and the suggestion the Russians would pay his way to the Soviet Union. Now, this is the tragedy of people like Bernard Fensterwald with his links to the CIA, or Mark Lane with I don't know what links. He works with Fensterwald. Fensterwald's on his committee. George O'Toole, the people that I've mentioned on Dialogue Conspiracy, who are blocking researchers like Errol Weisberg or Penn Jones, myself, Sherman Skolnick, many, many fine researchers. They're blocking our access to Richard Sprague through telephones, letters, no way to get to the committee. And the tragedy of the investigation of the House committee is that I could take to them facts of my 12 years' work and take them documents to show the many links of Oswald to the Central Intelligence Agency, and then it would explain the reasons why the transcripts deleted any conversation that Lee Harvey Oswald had that the Russians might pay his way back to the Soviet Union. Oswald, according to information I had, which is hard to document, it's strictly rumor stage, did leave the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and that a double was killed in his place, that he had a double that was substituted. And I know that one Lee Harvey Oswald did check out the Dallas jail, and the Warren Commission knew it at 1:45 on November 23rd, right after the press interview that Jack Ruby attended. But the unexplained reasons why the CIA deletes information, why the Warren Commission didn't have it, are perfectly explainable according to the research that many of us have done. But the committee back there flounders with the Oswald memo that he gave the Cuban embassy that he was going to kill Kennedy, or now they have this taped conversation of Oswald in the embassy. And you have a group of people who've never studied this subject, who've never really researched it at depth, who don't have the guts to call in the people who've done the work, who are going to flounder, use up as much time and money and saying, being as we didn't find this connection or that connection, there is no conspiracy in this area, or this is unexplained. So what you're going to end up is volume 2 of the Warren Report when this group gets through, because they have all these unexplained reasons for Oswald's activities in Mexico, and yet they can be explained, and it's a shame that we can't get to this committee. Oswald's transcript of his conversation was circulated to people in the CIA like Winston M. Scott, the station chief, and also a David Phillips. He was a former CIA officer in Mexico when Oswald was there and now heads the Association of Retired Intelligence Officers. And these men knew in September 1963, or were supposed to know, all of Lee Harvey Oswald's conversation at the hotel from Mexico City, the Russian embassy, that he was offering them information. And wouldn't they want to know what information he was offering? He was in the Soviet Union offering information about American radar in the Pacific, and according to his officer Donovan, they changed the radar systems, and yet he was brought home without being prosecuted, and now the CIA has recordings that he's offering information again after they paid his way home. The investigations will continue to prove, as time goes on, that the CIA was behind the killing of Kennedy, and I think it will also prove, as time goes on, that this committee back there is totally unable to handle the situation the way they're doing it, which can't be a coincidence the way it's set up. But every week maybe we'll cover a little bit about what they do each week so you can follow the progress. That's it for Dialogue Conspiracy. The time is up. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll see you next week.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California.